of a British industry that's worth over £1.4 billion a year. This is the story of how Britain became one of the biggest producers of computer games in the world, all thanks to one incredible game.
It was the first game where it tried to tell a story and it was a world that you got immersed in.
We've managed to track down the two Cambridge undergraduates who created the world's first fully 3D computer game.
We were terrified of someone else doing the same. You know, we weren't so arrogant to think no one else could do this.
Using primitive computers, they built what the professionals said was impossible. A 3D space game with 8 galaxies that people would play not just for hours, but for weeks.
They created not only a game that was inspirational at the time, but they created a whole new genre of game.
And the name of the game that changed the world? Elite. The world of computer games started changing the moment David Braben opened his Christmas present in 1981. Inside the wrapping paper was an Acorn Atom, one of the very first home computers.
That was a wonderful moment. I was very, very excited. It was a fascinating device, and I think it really captured my imagination. I really loved the sort of things you could do with computers.
On the other side of London was another computer-mad teenager, Ian Bell. He was working for his dad, but the best thing about the job was he got to play with the Office Micro.
When I had access to a computer, I would learn how to use it and play around with it. In the lunch hour and after work, on the way to my father to go home, I used to program games, just doing it for fun.
Until the 80s, computers had been enormous and expensive machines, serious pieces of hardware for large corporations, programmed to produce endless, boring printouts. But then they became cheap and were getting into our homes. They were nothing like the home computers we know today. To make them do anything, you'd have to program them yourself.
When you first switch it on, all you get is a little greater than sign in the top of the screen. And then it's a case of leafing through this great huge manual to work out what to do next. There was no software.
No software meant that in 1981, home computers needed to be programmed in a laborious language called BASIC.
I ask you, all I get after 10 minutes of programming are the words, "Hello, Peter." Terrific! But let's face it, very, very basic.
Despite the limitations of the BASIC programming language, to teenagers like David and Ian, the home computer opened the door to a whole new world.
Kids could just get in there and program it to do exactly what they wanted it to do. They started writing games, which are the things that they wanted. They wanted to be entertained, and they could make these things do it.
Back in 1981, computer games were as limited as the computers on which they were played. Simple two-dimensional affairs like Pong or Space Invaders.
Space Invaders was quite an interesting game. It was compulsive. Pong and stuff I didn't think much of. I didn't really think much of most of the early games.
There was an expectation that, for example, a game would take 10 minutes to play through. There was an expectation that it would have 3 lives. There was an expectation it would have a score. And all of these things had almost become written in stone, which is utterly ridiculous.
Those early 2D games were produced by some of the biggest companies in the world, like EMI and Atari. But David had bigger ideas. He wanted to do something no one else had ever done. Something that the big companies thought was impossible.
I was very, very excited by 3D graphics even before I had a computer, because I thought, oh, it can't be that hard, as an arrogant teenager might do. But the received wisdom at that time was that you couldn't do it on a home computer.
The key problem in creating 3D was lack of memory.
Just to give you an idea how things have changed, this mobile phone has 250,000 times the memory of David's new Atom.
Very quickly, the computer memory was full with this data, and the 3D that I first tried doing was really, really slow.
It had taken him months of programming to produce a simple, spinning spaceship. But David had created the impossible. 3 dimensions on a tiny home computer.
To me, it looked amazing, and I knew I was onto something that was exciting. Now, that might be because I'm a bit of a sado and okay, maybe slightly obsessed by that sort of thing. It triggered in me this sort of feeling of wonder that you can create a world.
David might have created a 3-dimensional rocket, but it was only a demonstration, not a game. What ultimately became Elite started when he arrived at Jesus College, Cambridge, and met a young maths student, Ian Bell.
My first impression of Ian when I met him at Cambridge was, I think a lot of people could probably guess. He's a really nice guy, but when you first look at him, he does look a bit odd.
I describe myself as a fairly geeky, politically naive, intellectual, academic type.
In some respects, we were quite alike, and in other respects, we were immensely different.
Almost from their first meeting, Ian and David began collaborating on what would become one of the most groundbreaking computer games in history.
This was a marriage made in heaven. What David and Ian dared to dream about was not just a game you played, but a fully 3D world in which you lived. A world where you'd be the commander of your own spaceship, flying from planet to planet, trading with alien beings and shooting it out with pirates on a galactic scale.
These were mad ideas, creating a fully 3D world and a game that you could play not just for hours but for days. It would have seemed impossible to most people back in the computer game age of 1982, but not to Ian and David.
At the time, we just had films like Star Wars, where it paints a world in your mind, and I thought we could do that in a game.
It was the 3D graphics, that was the first challenge. We needed to know that was viable before we could do anything else, because that was going to be the problem. If it didn't work, we wouldn't have a game.
The spark that became Elite really caught fire when David gave Ian the program for his 3D spinning rocket. Ian not only got it to run faster, but managed to produce a whole screen full of rockets at the same time.
There it suddenly was. They looked like solid objects and they were flying in an aesthetic way. It was a 3D scene on the computer, which I hadn't seen before. And it just looked good, and that's when I knew. That's when I said, the 3D works. That was when we knew the game was possible, assuming we could fit it into the memory.
Convinced that they could turn David's 3D demo into a fully fledged computer game, the pair formed the partnership that would help create Britain's multi-billion-pound games industry.
The key thing was it had to have great fighting in spaceships, and the reason it's space is because space is easy to draw. There's not a lot. It says the clue is in the name. There's not a lot there.
To start with, it was very short, sharp and list. 3D space in the sense of the environment you were moving around in, and some sort of trading which would involve multiple systems, so some way of going between planets. And that was basically all we had to start with.
In 1982, David and Ian only had a tiny demonstration of their 3D dream.
Now they had to achieve something even more incredible, to turn their 3D rotating rocket not just into a fully functioning universe, but into a game that people wanted to buy. And they had to do it before someone else beat them to it.
When Space Invaders was as good as it got, 2 Cambridge undergraduates were attempting to revolutionize the computer game industry, creating the world's first fully 3D computer game.
And in so doing, they kick-started an industry that now puts Britain in the top 4 in the world, with exports worth around £4 billion a year.
We were possibly the first people to do what would now be called a big game, a game where the player has to put a lot of commitment into playing it as well as us to writing it.
It was a huge challenge. Working day and night, David and Ian were out to beat some of the biggest names in computers at their own game.
Creating a computer game at that time was no mean feat. You couldn't just download an application off the net to do it. You did everything from scratch. So, writing a game was a real task.
We didn't have tools to design the spaceships. We were designing them on graph paper and typing in the numbers. We had no error checking or anything. The code had to be right. And so if it didn't work, we would then have to pore over the code to figure out why it didn't work. And that does become quite an obsessive process. You had to be very motivated to do something.
As ever, memory was their problem. Our heroes were now using the new BBC Micro, boasting a mouth-watering 18K of usable memory.
This was a computer built by some of the best engineers in the business. Yet the first thing David and Ian did was make it work better, pushing the usable memory from 18K to 22K.
Let's try and put this into some kind of perspective. This email here, 675 words, took 22 kilobytes of my computer's memory. Now, what Ian and David were trying to do was to use that amount of computing power to create a universe in 3 dimensions.
We'd worked out that we could only afford a few thousand bytes, that's a few thousand letters worth of space, to store the whole world.
To try and achieve their 3D dream, David and Ian started programming in a new computer language called assembly. Very hard to master, but using far less computer memory than BASIC.
Programming in assembly language is a very different animal from programming in BASIC. You're programming down to the metal, which means you're telling the chips on the board exactly what you want them to do. Because of that, you can get a lot more programming into a smaller space. The program has no fat on it.
But a tiny amount of memory was not their only worry. The world of computer games was changing fast, and there was always the possibility that one of the big companies might produce a 3D game first.
Our main worry was that someone else would do it, because as soon as we found out that it was possible, it would then become possible that someone else was doing it too.
We were terrified of someone else doing the same. We weren't so arrogant to think no one else could do this. So that's why we were very, very secretive.
Every spare moment, not taken up by their degrees, was spent on developing their game.
What had begun as a hobby would have to become a business if it were to justify the amount of time they were devoting to it. But would anyone be interested?
Their game was so different to anything on the market that there was the worry that no one would understand it.
We knew we had a viable product technically then. We didn't know for sure we had a saleable game, something that could be successfully marketed or that people would want to play. All we knew is that we create something we would want to play.
In the autumn of 1982, David and Ian could wait no longer. It was time to see what the computer game industry thought of their creation.
I was very excited. I was very proud of what we've done.
Demonstrating it to one of the biggest entertainment publishers in the world, the mighty Thorn EMI, was a do-or-die moment.
And we showed it to them, and they said they were very, very interesting technical demonstration. But we don't think it's going to work as a game.
Everything we liked about it, they didn't like.
My first feeling was, oh no, what if they're right?
Thorn EMI's big hit that year was River Rescue, a classic 2D game like this, which ticked all the boxes a game was meant to have in those days.
They wanted what we used to call the 7 golden eggs scenario, where you had some sort of mission throughout the game which you had to find the 7 golden eggs scattered around the galaxies, and once you'd found them, you'd won.
People want to play for 10 minutes. People want 3 lives. You know, they want to score. You're changing all this. And they gave us a rejection letter. They were looking at it from a marketing perspective based on games that were already out. They weren't seeing what was there. And that did frustrate me and annoy me.
Especially in the computing industry, you find that people turn down things that you can easily mock now, but it would have been a big investment for somebody to back a couple of guys that were still at college.
But the boys were determined not to give up. Down, but not out, their next port of call was a much smaller company, Acornsoft.
They were the software offshoot of Acorn, the makers of the BBC computer. Their grimy offices up a Cambridge alleyway were 1,000,000 miles away from the marketing whiz kids at EMI who'd missed the point.
The most important thing about Elite for me was the fact that it combined 3 different aspects of entertainment. It had the graphics, it had the keyboard manipulation, it had the adventure, and it had the strategy. These I had never seen combined together before.
The reaction couldn't have been more different. The Acornsoft were truly impressed, I think it would be fair to say.
We knew people liked it, which was very gratifying. We'd gone with our own instincts about not underestimating the players. We were treating the players like adults in a sense, even though they were mostly children, and it worked.
David and Ian were at the beginning of something really exciting. A few jaw-dropping scenes.
With Acornsoft backing them, the demo could now be turned into a fully blown game. But then came the news they'd been dreading. Someone had claimed to have created a 3D game for the Sinclair ZX computer. But when they finally got a copy, it only confirmed how far ahead of the competition they still were.
It wasn't really 3D. It was you were a camera looking at a 3D world, but the camera wasn't rotating. You couldn't sort of roll over. You couldn't jump up over the walls. It's not 3D in the sense of Elite, which is where there's no preferred direction. You're genuinely in space.
The heat was on. Ian and David really had to up their game now. Their struggle was to create the universe in just 22K of memory.
We would spend ages finding what we call byte savings. If you spent 2 hours staring at the code and you managed to save 3 bytes, you consider that time well spent, which just seems crazy now, but it was so crucial.
Incredibly, they found the answer, but not at the cutting edge of computing.
They turned the clocks back 800 years and enlisted the help of this chap, Leonardo Fibonacci, a 13th century mathematician. Fibonacci had discovered a way of generating seemingly random numbers using a very simple formula.
His formula explained patterns in nature. Now David and Ian wanted to use his formula to create galaxies.
That is such a powerful technique that you can generate anything by that, whether it's the layout of stars in a galaxy or whether it's to create a character's name.
Suddenly 22K of memory could accommodate all the galaxies they'd ever dreamt of.
We realised that we could have as big a universe as we wanted.
The universe they dreamed of would have 2,500 planets, each with its own alien race, and it'd be spread across 8 separate galaxies.
Elite on a screen was clearly meant to remind you of 2001 Space Odyssey. What was quite astonishing about it was that it seemed to mimic what was happening in 2000 Space Odyssey really rather well.
It was now the spring of 1984, and Ian and David were still refining their game in every moment of spare time they had. But Acornsoft were keen to get it to market as soon as possible.
After 18 months of mounting tension, Acornsoft called a halt. They made a decision. They would begin production.
Elite now had all the ingredients needed to change the world of computer games forever. And Acornsoft were determined that it would get the full Hollywood treatment. Selling at twice the price of rival games, it would even come with its own novel.
I think Elite was much more than just about the 3D graphics. It was about the universe that you could fly around. It was about the novel that came with the book that set the whole scene and really put you in the game. It's probably one of the first times I think that a game had ever been packaged like that.
Acorn were determined this was going to be big.
They decided to do something that had never been done before, to give the game a major launch by hiring an entire theme park for a day.
But for all that David and Ian were about to become the first computer game superstars, they still only had one thing on their minds: making Elite perfect.
I had a sort of nirvana moment 2 weeks before the game was due to go to press. I'd worked out a way of doing a new radar. We just thought, wait, this is so fantastic. We should put this in the game. And we showed it to Acorn with the obvious, well, I know we're not supposed to be touching this, but isn't this great? And they were of the same opinion.
One of the jobs of a publisher is to draw a line. We've got to stop here. It would have been a terrible shame if we insisted on launching an application like Elite, which was unfinished, truly unfinished.
What our heroes had done was to use the last few bytes of the computer's memory to redesign this old 2D control panel to a 3D radar system.
This last-minute stroke of genius became one of the best-loved features of the game.
Privately, I don't know how much they may have cursed us, but I think it was obvious to everybody at Acornsoft just how much better this system was.
The printing presses finally began rolling in the summer of 1984, by which time David and Ian had invested 3 years of their lives creating a game that was nothing like anything on the market. But no one knew if the world was ready for an intergalactic trading game that could last for weeks.
But luckily it seemed Elite was the game the gamers had been waiting for.
The first time I saw Elite, I was amazed. These 3D spinning graphics on the screen just hadn't been seen before. And the ability to fly around a universe in your own little world blew me away.
The fact that so many people were clearly so impressed with the game made me very excited indeed. I was suddenly plunged into a world that felt deeply alien, with people asking questions and microphones and all that sort of thing. I mean, I was stunned by it all.
Almost overnight, Elite blew everything else out of the water. At that time, there were 150,000 BBC microcomputers in the UK, and Acornsoft sold 150,000 copies of the game, an incredible one for every machine in the country.
We were the first, I believe, first non-US game to get to #1 on the Billboard charts. In fact, I think we were the first non-US game to get into the Billboard charts, never mind go to #1.
It inspired so many other programmers to get out and start writing programs now they'd seen what was possible.
It steered people into the field of computer graphics and the field of computer mathematics.
I'm forever being said, oh yes, I came into the industry because of you, because of Elite.
Elite was the product of 2 young students who dared to dream the impossible.
Even better, by breaking the mold, they had created a game which helped catapult Britain to the forefront of a world industry.